So, good morning, sir. Good morning to each and everyone. Before to proceed to the main topic, I would like to introduce myself first. I am Rick Zolme Opeleno Janela from BMLS 2A. So, our topic for today's video was all about Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act of 1997 or the Republic Act 8371 IPRA. Historical evolution of RA 8371. IPRA, generally known as the Ancestral Domain Bill, it was introduced in Congress in 1987 as Senate Bill No. 909 by Senator Santanina Rasul, Senator Joseph Estrada, and Senator Alberto Romulo during the 8th Congress, but it was never enacted into law. Senator Rasul introduced Senate Bill No. 1029 in the 9th Congress, while Senator Gloria Macapagal Arroyo introduced Senate Bill No. 1849. The bill, however, was never sponsored or debated on the floor. Despite their previous failures, the IPOs decided to give it another shot. During social negotiations among NGOs and POs, it was decided to rename the bill from the Ancestral Domain Bill to the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act in order to emphasize the bill's holistic approach and character. In December 1995, IP representatives and NGO representatives reached an agreement. There are 7 non-negotiable points of the Republic Act 8371. The first was recognition of native title and rights of indigenous peoples, or IPs, to ancestral domains. Second, respect for the right to cultural integrity. Third, recognition of indigenous peoples' politic structures and governance. Fourth, delivery of basic services to the indigenous peoples. Fifth, respect for human rights. Sixth, elimination of discrimination. And 7, lastly, is creation of an office that would cater to IP's needs. The RA 8371. Senator Juan Flavier introduced Senate Bill No. 1728 in the 10th Congress in 1996. He explained the bill's legal foundation in the 1987 Constitution during his sponsoring speech. He also spoke about the fundamental rights of indigenous cultural communities, or the ICCS, the bill's contents, and the urgent need for the Filipino indigenous peoples to be protected. Despite significant obstacles and modifications adopted in Congress, the House of Representatives finally approved the bill late in September 1997, practically putting the campaign to rest on October 29, 1997. President Fidel V. Ramos signed the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act of 1997, which intends to recognize, protect, and promote the rights of indigenous cultural communities, or indigenous peoples, the ICCs or IPs, and for other purposes. These are the definition of terms. Indigenous peoples of the Philippines. The Philippines is a culturally diverse country with an estimated 14 to 17 million indigenous peoples, or IPs, belonging to 110 ethno-linguistic groups. They are mainly concentrated in northern Luzon. The Cordillera Administrative Region was 33%, and Mindanao is 61%, with some groups in the Visayas areas as of 2013. Term indigenous peoples as used to reflect the contemporary international language which was formally adopted in 1993. The term indigenous cultural communities, or the ICCs, was coined by the Philippine Constitution to describe a group of people who share common bonds of language, customs, traditions, and other distinctive cultural traits, and who have occupied, possessed, and used a territory under claims of ownership since time immemorial. Time immemorial refers to a period of time in which particular ICs or IPs are known to have occupied, possessed, and used a specific region devolved to them. By operation of custom law, traditions are inherited from their ancestors as far back as memory can reach. IPs and ICCs are both terminology for homogeneous communities that have continually lived as a community on communally bounded and defined land, sharing common links of customs, traditions, and other cultural qualities through resistance to colonization, non-indigenous faiths, and culture. While the majority of Filipino learned the ways of the colonial masters by adapting to their laws and practices, the minority IPs consciously asserted the integrity of their ancestral territories, pre-Hispanic native culture, and justice system that are diametrically opposed to the majority's worldview, but which the IPRA law attempts to recognize and interface with the national legal system. Ancestral domains. Ancestral domains are defined by the 1997 IPRA law as areas generally belonging to IPs, comprising lands, inland waters, coastal areas, and natural resources held under a claim of ownership, occupied or possessed by IPs, communally or individually since time immemorial, continuously to the present even when interrupted by war, force majeure or displacement by force, deception, stealth, or as a result of government projects or policies. It shall include forests, pastures, residential, agriculture, and other lands individually owned, whether alienable and disposable otherwise, hunting grounds, burial grounds, worship areas, bodies of water, mineral and other natural resources, and lands that may no longer be exclusively occupied by ICs or IPs, but from which they traditionally had access for their subsistence and traditional activities, particularly the home ranges of ICCs and IPs who are still nomadic and traditional. Ancestral lands. Lands occupied, possessed, and used by individuals, families, and clans who are members of the ICC's IP since time immemorial, by themselves or traditional group ownership continuously to the present even when interrupted by war, force majeure, or displacement by forced deception, stealth, stealth, or as a result of government projects and other voluntary deeds according to the law. So, these are the land that occupied by their ancestors and or family. Next is the key provision. Section 13, the governance. The state acknowledges and respects ICC's IP's intrinsic right to governance and self-determination, as well as their beliefs, practices, and institutions. As a result, the state must ensure that ICC's IPs have the freedom to pursue their economic, social, and cultural growth. Next is the Section 15, the justice system, conflict resolution institutions, and peace-building processes. Within the respective communities, the ICC's IPs shall have the right to use their own commonly accepted justice system, conflict resolution institutions, peace-building processes or mechanism, and other customary laws and practices, as long as they are compatible with the national legal system and internationally recognized human rights. Next is the Section 16, right to participate in decision making. ICC's IPs have the right to fully participate in all levels of decision making in topics that may affect their rights, lives, and destinies, as well as to retain and build their own indigenous political systems. If they so desire, as a result, the state must ensure that the ICC's IPs are represented in policy-making bodies and other local legislative councils. Next is the Section 17, right to determine and decide priorities for development. The ICC's IPs shall have the right to set their own development priorities that influence their lives, beliefs, institutions, spiritual well-being, and the lands they own, occupy, or use. They must be involved in the development, implementation, and evaluations of policies, plans, and programs for national, regional, and local development that may have a direct impact on them. Next is the Section 18, the Tribal Barangays. In accordance with the Local Government Code on the creation of tribal barangays, IC's, ICC's IPs living in contiguous areas of communities where they form the majority of the population but are located in municipalities, provinces, or cities where they do not form the majority of the population may form or constitute a separate barangay. Next is the Section 19, Role of People's Organization. The state must acknowledge and respect the role of autonomous ICC's IPs organizations in enabling ICC's IPs to pursue and protect their legitimate and collective interests and aspirations through peaceful and legal ways. Next is Section 20, Means for Development Empowerment of ICC's IPs. The government shall establish The government must create the conditions for the full development, empowerment of the ICC's IPs, own institutions and activities, as well as providing the required resources. These are the rights to ancestral domain. Chapter 3, Section 7 of the Republic Act No. 8371 of 1997 covers the 8 rights to ancestral domain. This chapter focuses on the identification and protection of the entitlement of the indigenous cultural communities, or ICC, and the indigenous peoples, IPs, as the proper owners of their ancestral, and the following rights are listed below. First is the social justice and human rights. Ah, yeah. This section of the IPRA was intended to recognize indigenous peoples' claim to the same benefits and protection as other citizens of the state. The law highlights that all ICC IPs have a legal right to fundamental universal human rights, and that the state should actively work to promote an inclusive environment. Among these are the following. First is the equal protection and non-discrimination of ICC's IPs. Wait. This provision, which is modeled after international standards established by the United Nations, chartered the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Equal Protection Clause in the Philippine Constitution of 1987, holds the state accountable for the implementation of the IP's human rights. The state is thus called upon to recognize the ICC's IPs as a vulnerable group that has historically been denied socioeconomic chances and to ensure that the IPs are afforded equal legal protection. Second, rights during armed conflict. The state is expected to uphold and ensure respect for the Geneva Conventions in all circumstances, including local and international armed conflict. As a signatory to the conventions in times of disasters and conflicts, the state, through the NCIP, has the authority to safeguard the safety of all people, including IPICCs. This being said, areas under ancestral domains and members of indigenous tribes require special regulation beyond that of the convention, as legally recognized ICCs are given the freedom to govern their territories by their own laws. Through the IPRA, the state must not: first, recruit children of the ICC's IPs into the armed forces under any circumstances. Second, conscript or recruit ICC IP individuals against their will to the to the armed forces, and in particular for use against other indigenous peoples. Next is relocate ICC IP communities to special centers for military purposes. Next, force ICC IP communities, families, or individuals to abandon their lands, territories, or means of subsistence, and lastly, require indigenous individuals to work for military purposes under discriminatory conditions. So, freedom from discrimination and right to equal opportunity. Social security through the Republic of the Philippines Social Services System, housing, vocational training, and employment support through the Department of Social Welfare develops various efforts and complete health coverage through the PhilHealth. No balance billing from government hospitals are all examples of services that fit this provision. Next is women, children, and youth. The government must offer a system that allows women and youth to have a better understanding of indigenous culture while maintaining their human dignity. In accordance with each tribe's customary laws, the law guarantees that women's and youth's rights be fully realized, but it also mandates that all procedures and programs be culturally sensitive and appropriate to the requirements of ICC's IPs. An example of the programs geared towards the execution of this particular provision in the IPRA is the Culturally Sensitive Daycare Program for both IP children and their mothers, which NCIP mentions in its first administrative order. Lastly, the gaps in the law. As evidence in ongoing Mangyan case since 2011, which evicted indigenous Manyans from a claimed land they had been using for many years. Multinational companies and local government units now have the power to resist ancestral claims and use the IPRA law itself to counter indigenous land claims. The Puerto Galero local government unit declared in 2015 that the indigenous territory would be turned into a sanitary landfill, and that the Manyans would be transferred to a site near the landfill. The government will cut down all Mangyan planted coconut trees on the dump site, and the local government and unit will only compensate the Manyans with 100 pesos, about $2 each. So, thank you for listening. That's all about my report. Thank you. Goodbye.